Hi everyone, it's Miss Noreen. Before I get started on Circle, I wanted to update everyone on my challenge to come and draw me a picture in the driveway. My first visitor was Corey a few days ago. He came and drew me a picture, and then Olivia and Enzo came, and then Haley, and then Lucy and Caroline, and it was so nice to see you guys. I really miss seeing everybody every day. Then the rain came and washed all my beautiful pictures away, but Caroline and Lucy have both come back to make me some new pictures. So maybe if you haven't been by yet and you're walking by, you can stop. Some friends have been driving over. You can park right in the driveway. We're not going anywhere. But it's just so nice to see a few of my friends for a few minutes anyway. So I hope you're all keeping busy. I've been trying to exercise a lot and reading some books, and today I started this puzzle. It has 1,000 pieces. I don't know if Miss Noreen will actually finish it, but I'll let you know in a few days how I'm doing. I just started today. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. So today the book that I'm going to read for you is Mr. Noisy. This is one of my favorite books. He's very loud. Are we ready? Mr. Noisy was a very, very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy were reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at you at the top of his voice. And at the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place. You can hear it 100 miles away. That means if I was reading in Mr. Noisy's voice, you could probably hear me from your house. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But, achoo! When Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now this story starts with Mr. Noisy asleep in his bed, in his bedroom, in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring, and as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants running than a snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so too did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled, the house wobbled, the whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high above Wobbletown wobbled. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the baker's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb the baker. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. Then Mr. Noisy went along the street to the butcher. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a piece of meat, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. Afterward, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy, she said. Absolutely, replied Mr. Bacon. But what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb, and she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you have the answer. The following day, Mr. Noisy again went down to Wobbletown to shop. Clump, clump, clump. He went into Mrs. Crumb's bake shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. I'm sorry, what did you say? Asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread, shouted Mr. Noisy. "Sorry," said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. "Can you speak up, please?" "I'd like a loaf of bread." "I can't hear you," replied Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. "I'd like a piece of meat," Mr. Noisy boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. "I'd like a piece of meat," Mr. Noisy shouted. "Did you say something?" asked Mr. Bacon. "I said I'd like a piece of meat." "Pardon?" said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out and went home and went to bed hungry. The next day Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. "I'd like a loaf of bread," he boomed. What?" asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the very top of his voice, "A loaf of—" And then he stopped. And then he thought. And then he said quietly, "I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb." Mrs. Crumb smiled. "Certainly," she said. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. "I'd like a piece of meat," he boomed. "Did you say something?" asked Mr. Bacon. "Yes, I did," shouted Mr. Noisy at the very top of his voice. "I said I'd like a—" And then he stopped, and he thought. And then he said quietly, "I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon." Mr. Bacon smiled. "My pleasure." So carrying the bread and the meat, Mr. Noisy set off for home up the hill. Clump, clump, clump. And then he stopped. And then he thought. And then, do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never, ever tried before. It was fun. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put out his hand to open the door. And then he stopped. And then he thought. And then, do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly. He stepped inside, and then he shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently were two things Mr. Noisy had never tried before either. They were fun too. And do you know something? Mr. Noisy isn't as noisy as he used to be. And do you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy has even learned how to whisper. I hope you like that story. I am going to go right now and I'm going to color a picture, like Miss Joanne said, of a rainbow and put it in my window. So maybe you guys can do the same. I hope you all enjoyed the story, and I'll see you guys next time. Love you. Bye.